Welcome into the show, Megan Gorman.
Hey, Matthew, I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Well, I'm excited to dig into your book a little bit today as somebody that is always trying to learn from people of the past, people of the present, and figure out how that kind of ties into my future. This is a really fun and exciting read for anybody that's trying to build better financial skills, kind of maybe retool their mindset around money and wealth building. And, what better way to learn than from the author herself? So welcome.
Exactly. And to dive into the presidents, right? They're so serious when they're presidents, but, people's money makes them a little more human. And so I think it's fun to dive in because in particularly, there are a lot of presidents that you probably like that you wouldn't like financially. And there are probably presidents you don't like that you may like financially. It's sort of funny. There's no rhyme or reason to the politics.
Well, and I love that we can kind of, separate maybe the personality from the results that they've gotten and kind of dig into a little bit more of the tactics and the strategy behind it, some of the qualities and characteristics that they may have embodied and exemplified. And I'm just curious, being that you've been in a world of finance, in private equity and Wall Street, to wealth management, to all different facets. What led you to writing this book and why focus it around presidents?
So at the heart of it, I am a total history geek. And one of the things that you realize when you are in wealth management and working in the tax world is really, it's all about history, right? You have to know where you've been. And then you have to always be able to talk to clients about where we are, not just in the market cycle, but in things like tax policy. Right. And so you start to get a really interesting view of the world. Now, I've loved the presidents and studying them since I was like 6 years old. And so when I read, I'm always trying to understand what was really going on financially. And I do this all the time with everybody, even when you go to the movies, right? It's like, wait, how did that work financially? I'm a little bit older than you, but when Sex and the City was out the first time around, I was always doing the math going, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense how they're living this lifestyle in New York. And I know this because I was living there at the time. And I was the one budgeting to be able to go out, to be able to afford a cocktail and a taxi ride home. So these things, these little nuances are what fascinates me. And what you find is that there's sort of a common theme to all of us. And I'll give you a great example. When I was going through the letters of Lyndon Johnson, and it was in the early 40s. And I noticed he had a letter where he said, it's 2 a.m. and I'm up worried about money. I also found letters of Harry Truman talking about being up at 2 a.m. worried about money. I can tell you in my own life, I'm up at 2 a.m. worried about money.
Yeah,
right?
Who hasn't been there?
So it's like, wait a minute, you don't think about these historical figures stressing in the middle of the night about what they're spending, but yet they did. And so I think there's something to be learned there from them in what they did that worked and what they did that didn't work.
Yeah. And maybe we can talk a little bit about that. And maybe for those that don't know about the book, what it's about, what's in it, what they should think about learning. Of course, we're going to be talking about some of those things today, but maybe share a little bit more about what all the president's money is.
Yeah. So first of all, it's non-political because I think everyone is tired of politics.
Oh, man.
Right?
Strap in. We got a ways to go.
We got a ways to go. Totally. But, I've worked in high net worth and ultra high net worth my entire career. And there are certain skills and traits I've seen in my clients: grit, the ability to budget, connect with your future self, luck. And in looking at that, I thought, what a great way to sort of talk about this in using the different stories of the presidents. So I take you through about 11 different skills and traits, and I tell you about how some of the presidents did really well with those skills and how some failed miserably. And so two of the presidents I've already brought up, Lyndon Johnson and Harry Truman, both, relatively modern presidents, but both of them did not grow up with money. And so both of them found different ways to make money. I would tell you Johnson was probably a little more successful than Truman, but they both went through those struggles. And I think that's what's really important, is to understand, if you read these stories and you see how LBJ did it, What did he do that maybe you could do in your own story?
What are some of those common denominators that come to mind amongst, maybe all of the successful presidents that have found a way to win financially over the course of their career and their lifetime? And these are qualities and characteristics that you see others having the ability, even if they don't have them, to learn them, to find a way to integrate them into maybe their mindset or their disciplines and their habits. What are some of those that come to mind for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think out of the gate, the two basic skills that can always benefit all of us is the ability to budget and the ability to connect to your future self. Now you're probably like, "Oh my goodness, I'm so sick of hearing about budgeting," right?
Mm.
Or as we say in high net worth, cash flow management. But the ability to the put on a page, the ability to put on a page your numbers and really press on them is incredibly powerful. And I think you can really go to our very first president, George Washington, to get an understanding of that. Now, Washington, while he grew up in a family that had means, he was the child of the second marriage. And so when his father passed, all of the wealth went to his older brother, Lawrence. And here was poor George, couldn't go to college, right? Really was trying to figure out how to make his way. And he took up the skills of surveying. He actually learned that by reading a book and befriending a neighbor. His neighbor were the Fairfaxes of Fairfax, Virginia. And they taught him surveying. But what George did that was really, really powerful was that he kept impeccable budgeting. And if you ever want to see beautiful records, you want to see George Washington's budgeting. Because what he was doing is he was really, truly trying to understand where he was with the numbers. Now, when he was surveying, he was trying to build wealth. But those skills he was able to parlay over the course of his life into taking care of the Continental Army and eventually becoming our first president. But he did budgets his whole life. In comparison, when you think about skills like future self, when they study who's most successful on money, it's the people who can visualize and connect with their future self. So the Matthew at 50, 60, 70, 80 years of age, if you can sort of connect with him and sort of say, "Oh, that guy is my friend. I'm going to make decisions today that will benefit him," you will often make better decisions financially. And it's sort of amazing that these two characteristics can really drive wealth, but they do.
Yeah.
And I'll give you a really quick story. George Washington's peer at the time, Thomas Jefferson, who, incredibly educated, unbelievable writer, eloquent, well-traveled, he could not keep a budget to save his life. And so if you look at Washington and you look at Jefferson, it wasn't just getting the numbers down on the page, but it was thinking about where they wanted to go. And I think for Washington, growing up without a safety net and knowing he wanted to build wealth, he had to think about the person he wanted to be. Jefferson, he didn't do it as much, right? He was much more focused of living in the now. And that's all, and that's where he disconnected and wasn't able to think about who he wanted to be in the future in terms of money.
I love that.
Those are the two skills I'd say out of the gate.
Super important. I think just what comes to mind, one is it doesn't need to be crazy complicated, right? Some of these things can be really simple, and if executed consistently over time can really lead to big results. And just how important it is to be clear, right? To have clarity, whether it's clarity around your numbers and how much you're saving or how much you're losing, whether it's clarity around where you're going and what plan and what people, and what actions align with that or don't. That's what I have found, I think as more and more people start getting in, making money, building a business, making investments, and you learn the wealth building game and kind of how it's played, you realize it's not as complicated as you might think. It's more so around clarity and around stamina and around discipline to do just the simple things that most people get burnt out on. Completely.
And you said something there. You said discipline. And, in working with high net worth individuals, I will tell you that to build wealth, you've got to have discipline, but you also have to have opportunity. And I say this because, the ability to have both options, discipline and opportunity, is becoming harder and harder today, right? I think that overall, when you look at the stories of the presidents and how a lot of them built wealth, and remember, they didn't monetize like they do today back in the day, but a lot of them, had to get the opportunity set. Today, it's harder for a lot of Americans to get the opportunity set to build wealth. So if you're out there and you do have the opportunity, right? You have a job, you're making money, you get bonuses, you have 401k, you have equity, all of these opportunities, you really have to wrap the discipline around it because that's what makes a difference. And I'm always amazed. My clients who are the wealthiest are not usually the ones who had the most income, right? And sometimes they do because, because they're a corporate CEO. But a lot of the time, it's the ability to control the controllables. And going back to LBJ, when you think about him, you don't realize that he became incredibly successful with money because he did something that we don't always factor into this decision. He married someone who understood money. And I talk about it in the book, but the two decisions you make in life that really drive if you're going to have wealth or not is what you do and who you marry. And why this is so important is LBJ didn't grow up with money, but he married, Claudia Taylor Johnson, or lady known as Lady Bird. Let me redo that again. He married a woman by the name of Lady Bird, who became Lady Bird Johnson.
Okay.
And she had lost her mother at an early age and had gotten an inheritance. And because she was the only daughter in the house, her father treated her a bit like a boy and taught her about money. So when the two of them get together finally, and again, it was a love match, but it was also a match in terms of chemistry. He was the gas, she was the brake. He had passion. She liked to put restraint around things. And so when you read their letters to each other, they work really hard at being connected about money. And I can't emphasize that enough because if you're with someone who doesn't have the same values about money as you do, it's a lot harder to build wealth.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, statistically, right, when you look at the divorce rate and the number one category as a reason for divorcing being money, it really does emphasize that point and bring it home, right? That you have to have some shared vision, values, disciplines, responsibilities around those things. Because if you don't, it's two people running in two completely different directions. And eventually that rope is going to run out.
Yeah. And, just using a modern example, one of the reasons why I think Donald Trump and Melania Trump are probably quite well matched, financially speaking, I can't vouch for any of the rest of it, but both of them, to me, and looking at their documents and listening to them, they function at a transactional nature, right? Donald Trump, the big deal maker, right? He's charismatic. He's unafraid of risk, right? But he loves the transaction. And then you think about Melania, one of the things that's been very much in the public space is that they have a prenup. By the way, you'd expect them to have a prenup. Good on them. But she's also someone who understands her worth in the transaction. And so there have been renegotiations of the prenup. And what I like about their money story is they're aligned. They understand that, right? I don't think he would have done well with a woman who couldn't be transactional, right? I think he would have struggled with that because the values he has is, I love the deal. I mean, his book was called The Art of the Deal, right? So you see that in some of these marriages where there's just a lot of connection. They're coming at it with very similar values.
What is, if you had to pick one, your favorite president because of the money values or disciplines that he has and why?
Yeah, so everyone's always shocked when I say this, but Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover was born about 150 years ago in Iowa, and he was a Quaker. And so the Quakers had certain values that they imparted, but his family was sort of up and coming. His father was a bit of an entrepreneur. And when Hoover was 4, his father died suddenly. And then he was raised by his mother. She was a minister for the Quakers. And, she struggled to keep the family together. And then when he was about 10 years old, she passed away suddenly. Now, she had been smart enough to have a life insurance policy. Life insurance in the United States really took hold during the Civil War. And so when he was born in the 1870s, right, it was sort of a common thing now to start to buy. So here Hoover is with his two siblings, and they had some life insurance money living in this Quaker world. And so what they did is they put each of the children with a different guardian, but the Quakers picked an elder to be the financial guardian. And I bring this up because what would happen is if Herbert Hoover wanted to buy clothes for school or a book for school or needed medicine because he was sick, he had to help budget it out and submit the receipts to the financial guardian. Doesn't seem like much, but when you look at early education of children and learning about money, by chance, Hoover learning how to do this ties into what today academics feel is sort of the prime time to teach certain skills to children. Now, if you fast forward, Herbert Hoover ends up being in the first class at Stanford, graduates with a degree in geology, and there are no jobs. And, it's late 1890s. We're having, a recession in the United States and can't find a job in geology. So what does he do? He goes out to the Sierra Nevadas and goes down into the mines and learns how to mine. And I think this is really important because, you've got the budgeting. He went to Stanford, got the education.
Yeah.
And now he's learning how to do something. And the miners thought this was nuts, right? Some Stanford kid down in the mines. They're like, who is this kid? What is he doing here? Fast forward, he gets a job with a British firm. They send him to Australia and he's working, managing mines. And he sees a place and he says, there's gold there. I know there's gold there. I've been down in mines. I know what it looks like. And he convinces the company to buy it. They dig and they find gold and they strike gold. And it was him with his budgeting, his education, his sort of gaining what we call grit. And, Matthew, when I was reading your bio, I was struck by your grit too. But I think grit is something that we all can tap into in building wealth.
Yeah.
And it's not about talent. You got to have some talent. You got to have luck, right? It's about something deeper. It's a drive and it's the working hard. And so when you hear Hoover's story, what you also see is as he starts to make money, he's running these budgets. And he's got a friend back in the US that he sends his money to. And he's like, look, pay for this and this and this. But if so-and-so's having some financial troubles, please make sure you take care of them. Please give some money to the church. And so I think there's something in those stories where the money isn't just about, building up tons of wealth, but about sharing it and engaging it and making it more an expression of who you are is one of the reasons why I think Herbert Hoover becomes one of the more interesting presidents financially. Now, mind you, he gets moved all around the world. He has diamond mines, right, at one point. So he technically is our wealthiest president. Don't tell Donald Trump. He's actually sort of tied. George Washington and Herbert Hoover are neck and neck. But Hoover, by the time he becomes president, he's so incredibly wealthy, right? But a lot of it is from the skills he learned as a kid. So what I always tell people is you don't have to be the smartest in your class. You don't have to be the luckiest person. You don't have to have the most connections or the most charisma. What you really have to have is that grit that can propel you forward. And I've seen it time and time again with my clients and how they've made money.
Such a good story. And when people ask me how I've been successful, which is ultimately obviously modest compared to a lot of ultra wealthy people, I always just tell them I'm dumb enough to believe in myself and smart enough to take action and not give up every day. And that's that grit component that you talked about, right? Is there's so many people I think we could all point to and be like, that person has a lot of money. And it's not because they're the smartest, fastest, or strongest. It's just because they didn't give up and they just always believed in themselves and they kept moving the needle forward. And so I love that story. Who would you say is a president that you wouldn't want to emulate and why?
I wouldn't want to just put it on one person, right? Everybody's lives are a collection of experiences.
Yeah.
But what I would tell you is when I think of presidents who were unsuccessful with money, I do often think of Ulysses S. Grant, the great Civil War general. He's amazing as in the military. He's amazing during the Civil War, just a very authentic American character. But he didn't grow up with money and he struggled most of his life with money. And so he developed something that we see in people. He was obsessed with get rich quick schemes. Now, when I study money and I study my clients, most of my clients get wealthy very slowly.
Yep.
And then there's a momentum once you become wealthy. But really building wealth is sort of boring. It's like watching paint dry. I mean, that's what they say with the best investing, right? But with Ulysses S. Grant, he was looking for that big win. And so over the course of his life, he would do things, taking a chance, right? If, for instance, he went in with he came west to California in 1850. And, if you had to think of a time where you could put penny down in the dirt and a money tree would grow, it was 1850s California. San Francisco went in a matter of 3 years from a small town to having over 150,000 people in the town.
That's big.
And so Grant gets caught up in various schemes. One scheme he has is he wants to have a nightclub in San Francisco. And so he gives money to a guy who runs off with it. Another scheme with a bunch of other guys is they decide they're going to move ice down to San Francisco from the Vancouver area. But they didn't factor in that they were supposed to really think about what happens if the ice gets delayed. Well, it got delayed and it all melted. So you see this with Grant consistently. He's almost too trusting. And I often wonder if the skills that made him a great leader in a war, because you had to trust, particularly if you think about the Civil War and how they had to fight. He was so trusting. It also sometimes means it wasn't a good wealth building skill, because wealth building is, trust yet verify.
Yeah.
It's got to go slow. It's going to take time to build money. It's not something that happens overnight, right? You have to build success upon success. And so he's one of those ones that, as much as I love him as a character of American history, I'm always like, oh, you're killing me. Just don't do that. Don't chase the dollar. Build it slowly.
Yeah, I always refer to that as the crockpot the crockpot mindset versus the microwave mentality, which so many people, especially in the world we live in today, they just want it quick, they want it easy. But as you know, right, it's hard work and it's slow work too. You go slow to get fast, and eventually that compound effect starts to kick in and snowball. You talked about a couple of things that I think are important, and I'm always curious to get certain perspectives around these particular topics, which is, this idea of generational wealth and leaving a legacy. And as we know, there's a lot of people who create and amass great empires in their lifetime, and then their kids squander it away. And so how do you see the most successful people creating generational wealth and how they interact with their kids or their grandkids? And maybe what are some of the, the teaching points and lessons you would pass along to somebody that's got great wealth, but they don't necessarily know how to pass it on to their kids or how to educate and talk to their kids about it? What do you see?
I would tell you a lot of it has to do with values. And that's sort of a corny answer, right? You're like, oh, values, of course. But let me tell you a little bit of the Bush family, because I think that gives some context. And then I'll talk about some of the things I see with my clients. George H.W. Bush, he's a fabulous character, right? He is the ultimate patriot. If you said of all the 20th century presidents, who's the patriot? I would say, oh, it's H.W., right? From being in the military, being shot down to, the CIA, being an oil man. But what was really interesting in studying him is that his family had certain values. Now, his father, Preston Bush, was a wealthy man. He ended up being the senator from Connecticut, was on Wall Street. But the Bushes have a mantra, and it is basically like, we'll get you through college, but then you're on your own, and you can go a different direction. So, Preston Bush was in Wall Street. HW gets out of Yale, and he's got a wife and a baby W, and he's got to go figure this out. So what does he do? Instead of going and taking a deal on Wall Street, he goes to Texas, Midland, Texas, and gets into oil, gets into something he doesn't even know. He talks about it. Like, he and Barbara, they struggled. They were not rich kids getting sent checks. They were working like crazy to figure it out. And he ends up getting involved with a group of people, and they end up being able to be in the oil business. Fast forward, W comes into the picture. Now it's in the 70s. Dad's been a successful oil guy. Dad's now in government. What does W do? W goes to oil. Doesn't really succeed. It's not his forte. W has a wealth building skill that I see people that have it, and it's amazing. W has charisma. So what does W really make his money on? He gets together a group of people to buy a baseball team. He actually has the smallest ownership of the Texas Rangers when they buy it. But he's the one who's able to pull everyone together. So, Wall Street to oil to baseball. And then we have Jenna Bush today, right? Jenna Bush is on television, right? Completely different direction. So one of the things you think about with the Bushes, and that's an example you see the values is their values are never be afraid to strike out in a different direction, right? And be different and to carry on with where your passions are. And when I work with a lot of families, I will tell you that some of the struggles that you have with generational wealth is generational wealth requires you to have values and stick to it in a very strict fashion. That sounds easy, but nurture and nature come into being. So you could be generation one and you want to pass the wealth on to generation two, and you have 3 children in generation two of which are very good with money and one who is not, right? That can go sideways quickly, right? Yep. And that's where you see people get frustrated is, oh my goodness, I'm trying to pass to the next generation and they're not doing the things I think they should do, or only half of them are doing the things that I think that they should do. So really focus on values, on what your family values should be, how you see people you want working with, handling their money. What are the things you want them to do? And those are the families that I think do better than the ones that just keep passing wealth down with no sort of mindset attached to it. So be like the Bushes.
Now, obviously, kids squandering your money away is one way to lose it. Having a partner that you divorce is one way of losing it as well. What are your thoughts around prenups for somebody that either already has wealth or knows they're going to build wealth? What's your outlook on that? And what do you see a lot of your clients, successfully doing or not doing when it comes to a prenup?
Yeah, look, prenups make a lot of sense, but at the end of the day, you have to remember life is long, right? I mean, think about it. Now that, most people are living into their 80s. So if you get married at like 30, you got 50 years with this person. So I think having a prenup or an understanding of how wealth grows is important. But remember, even the best attorneys can undo a prenup. So a lot of it is, how are you going to manage money together? Right. A lot of the basic pillars of financial planning seem sort of corny, hokey, right? But if you think about it, sitting down with your spouse with a neutral third party to talk about money is really, really powerful, because you're probably, like with my husband and I, we're about 90% on the same page. And then there's that 10% where you look at your spouse and you're like, are you kidding me? Like, really? So I think having discussions about money is important. And I'm going to say this as a woman. I think for women, it's really important to always have your own money. I'm not saying don't commingle with your spouse, but having something of your own, I think, allows you to be an equal partner in the marriage. Because what's unfair to a lot of people in a marriage is there's often one spouse who ends up shouldering more of the burden. There was this story recently in the New York Times about a gentleman in the Hamptons who took his life. They were, keeping up with the Jones type family. The wife was on Instagram and so on. And what was striking to me is when you read the story in the New York Times, you realize this guy was shouldering a lot of the financial burden and probably not having the discussions he needed to have. Money and marriage is an equal team sport. So you got to have the discussions. And then just one last thing is, if you come into a marriage and you have assets, I think it is completely fine for you to have assets in a separate property trust. I'll tell you, from my own marriage, I met my husband. I was in my late 30s. He was in his late 40s. We both had assets. We have separate property trusts for those assets. All the money since we married, we've put together in a joint trust. And I know that seems like an odd way that even now, 15 years after being together, we're still functioning that way. But again, it's really about being prudent and setting appropriate expectations so that the marriage can work well together.
Brilliant. I love that, and great perspective that I think, oftentimes people just see it as so cut and dry, black and white, but I think there's more dialogue and discussion that needs to go into it to kind of fit each individual's, circumstance and situation of where they're starting from, where they're planning on going. So I love that insight and perspective. As we kind of wrap up, I'm curious to know on your thoughts of our current presidents or presidential candidates, or maybe their VPs, and what some of the takeaways or insights you have around their wealth building and money habits look like.
Yeah. No, I'll give it to you really quickly. I think let's start with some of the vice presidents. JD Vance is an interesting one, right? We all know the hillbilly elegy story,
Yeah.
but he has a path to wealth that is one that I think it's hard to copy. But again, it's one of the stories that you can have a lot of respect for. He gets into Yale Law School, right? This is a guy who's been working. He gets into college, he goes to college, and he finds a way into Yale Law School. And that's one of those things, education, where there are certain places that once you get in, you're getting a very different opportunity set. So God bless him for getting it, right? But what he also did is he didn't just coast on going to Yale Law. He maximized connections, right? He got to know Amy Chua, who wrote The Battle Cry of the Tiger Mom, right? She introduced him around, and he maximized his connections. He's a little like Ronald Reagan in that way, because Ronald Reagan built wealth very similarly in the 40s and 50s, because when Reagan was in the movie business, even though he had times he struggled, he became connected with a gentleman named Lew Wasserman, who helped Reagan, not only when Reagan became SAG president, but becoming a spokesperson for GE and the GE Theater. So Vance and Reagan are really sort of parallel because they were both good at using their connections when they got a shot. And both of them grew up poor. So it's not like they woke up and their next door neighbor were these people. So at the same time, when you look at Walz, he's an interesting one for me because he clearly understood early on he was never going to have the opportunity set that JD Vance had, right? He was a teacher and a coach. So when you look at his money, the first thing you notice is he doesn't have a lot of it, right? But he also doesn't have a lot of debt. And I think that he and his wife made choices to take jobs that generated a pension. And I think they lived within their lives, how much they were making. And he became Minnesota governor in 2019. And once he moved into the governor's mansion, he sold his house. And people have talked about this, like, that's sort of weird. And the first question I had was, how old were his children? And his kids were college age. So there's part of me that wonders if he was thinking, look, I got to get them in school and have them not take on a lot of debt. Because again, he knows being a teacher, it's hard to make money in this country and save. Yeah. So he's a little bit slow, steady, and risk adverse. So very interesting vice presidential candidates. Trump and Kamala, they cracked me up because you could totally see them in school. And Trump would have been the charming guy at school, saying things, taking crazy risks, right? Probably giving her a hard time because she's Miss Perfect, right? And when you look at her finances, she's a diversified portfolio, very conflict-free, ETFs. Every asset class is there. She has a revocable trust for an estate plan. Her husband sold his law firm partnerships, very much by the book, very perfect. And as a woman, I'll tell you, women strive to be quote unquote perfect. So when I saw her finances, I felt that they showed that sort of shaping that a woman would appreciate. So she's like our straight A student at school. And then you've got Trump. His money is a little bit harder to see. But I think the thing to keep in mind is, one, if you could see his tax return, most Americans couldn't understand it. Yeah, and the reason is he is subject to a part of the tax code that unless you're a real estate developer, you can't get access to, which has a lot of preferential tax treatment. So what I always say with Trump is, look, if whether you love him or hate him, he is very good at risk. He is the antithesis of Walz, right? And so think about the fact that he sometimes is unafraid to take chance and risk. And if you take that mindset and you look at things like your 401k and how you manage your money, right? Being all in cash is probably not the way Trump would do it. He'd probably be a little bit more heavy in equities if I had to like look under the hood, right? So I think what you're getting is Vance, really maximizes connection. Walz, he's mitigating risk. Trump is embracing risk, and Kamala is all about perfection. And so those are their four strengths. And see, I told you I'd be non-political. So pick your candidate who you like, but they're all interesting from a money standpoint.
One of the things that I love that you bring up that I think is always, I've just learned this over the evolution of my own journey as well. When you talk about opportunity sets, right? And let's just say the opportunity sets that Vance had versus Walz had, they're different because of the opportunity ecosystems they're playing in. One has just a lid on it. The other one has bigger upside and ROI next to it, right? So to think about what sandbox you're playing in, if you really want to be wealthy, you got to think about how high of an opportunity can this take me to? And is there a cap or a ceiling on it? Because I remember when I first started in single family houses, I would kind of hit that ceiling. I'm like, whoa, this isn't going to get me where I need to go. I need to figure out a new vehicle or opportunity set that I can play in. And as you evolve in that, right, you start to identify where your skills and the highest ROI in your time and your energy and your resources are at. So I just love that you bring that up, right? Because you could be the best of the best in one particular ecosystem or opportunity set, but there might be a lid on that, and that might limit how fast or how far you can grow your wealth and your money over the course of your timeline.
Completely. And so that's why I think Ronald Reagan is a good example. If you're really trying to maximize opportunity sets, think of your relationships, think of the people around you. And I'll leave you with one fun little factoid. We have 3 presidents that are born within 2 months of each other. Donald Trump in June of 46, George W., July of 46, and Bill Clinton in August of 46. This is because the soldiers were coming home from war. But what I think is really interesting about the 3 of them is when I think of them and I pull the politics out, the 3 of them are incredibly charismatic.
Yeah.
And don't ever underestimate the power of charisma in building wealth to get you a better opportunity set.
Such a great way to end such an awesome interview. So many great insights on wealth building, finances. I know a lot of people are going to want to pick up the book as well as check out more of your content, some of the stuff that you do. We got a lot of high net worth listeners that, always look for great connections and contacts. What's the best place for them to do that, Megan?
Sure. You can find me at allthepresidentsmoney.com. The book will publish on September 24th. And then I will be at some of the presidential libraries if you're geeky enough like me and you love those. And then if you want to learn more about my firm, it's Checkers Financial, and it's Checkers with a QU because it's the name of the house in England that passed through 800 years of wealth transfer.
Oh, I love that. Well, we'll be sure to link up all of that on Megan's episode, millionairemindcast.com. Megan Gorman, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me on.